In 2025, the football world suddenly discovered Curaçao. A tiny Caribbean island of just 156,000 people had qualified for the FIFA World Cup, achieving what far larger nations had failed to do. For a few days, everyone was asking the same question: where is Curaçao? The answer is stranger than most people expect. Because Curaçao is not simply another Caribbean island. It is a place where Dutch colonial buildings face South America, where a language spoken nowhere else on Earth became the voice of an entire nation. Where African, European, and Latin American histories collided on a sunburnt island, surrounded by some of the bluest water in the world. The World Cup made people notice Curaçao. But the island's story was remarkable long before football arrived. Subscribe for more travel documentaries from the most remote corners of the planet, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Curaçao is 444 square kilometers. You can drive across it in just over an hour. You can circumnavigate it in a morning if you stop for nothing. By any geographic measure, it is not a significant piece of land. The most powerful empires in history have fought over islands smaller than this. But Curaçao is not one of those islands. It never produced sugar in the volumes that made Barbados rich. It never had the strategic depth of Cuba or the population density of Haiti. It is, by almost every conventional measure, a minor feature of the Caribbean map. And yet, the geography that makes Curaçao minor is also the geography that made it significant. The island sits 65 kilometers north of Venezuela. Just outside the southern arc of the hurricane belt that destroys islands farther east and north every decade. That single fact has shaped everything. While Puerto Rico, Dominica, Sint Maarten, and the British Virgin Islands have rebuilt themselves multiple times after catastrophic storms, Curaçao has remained structurally continuous for centuries. The same buildings from the 1700s still stand in Punta. The same coral stone walls still line the harbour. The same trees still grow in the same places. There is a quality of permanence to Curaçao that other Caribbean islands do not have. And that permanence is not accidental. It is the gift of latitude. The other geographic gift is the harbour. The St. Anna Bay, is one of the deepest natural harbours in the southern Caribbean. And it was this that brought the Dutch here in 1634, when they seized the island from the Spanish. The Spanish had used Curaçao mainly as a cattle ranch and had largely ignored its potential. The Dutch saw what the Spanish had not seen: that this small, dry, hurricane-free island with a deep harbour was the perfect base for Atlantic trade. From this harbour, Dutch ships would move goods, people, and information across an ocean that was becoming, in the 17th century, the most important commercial waterway on Earth. The geography made Curaçao useful. The history made Curaçao complicated. The interior of the island is, as the aerial view suggests, arid. Cacti dominate the central landscape. The Dushi, which grows up to 6 meters high and looks like something out of a Sergio Leone film, and the more familiar prickly pear. Trees do exist, but they are mostly low, wind-bent, and adapted to drought. The most photographed are the divvy trees, whose trunks lean permanently to the west because the constant easterly trade wind pushes their growth sideways. They are the unofficial symbol of the island, living evidence of the wind that defines everything. The coast is where the geography softens. Curaçao has more than 35 beaches, most of them small, many of them hidden in coves between volcanic cliffs. The water is clear, calm, and warm year-round, protected by fringing reefs that extend close to shore in many places. The coral ecosystems around the island are among the healthiest in the Caribbean. Not because the locals have been perfect stewards, but because the same trade winds that batter the trees also keep water temperatures stable. And because the relatively low human pressure on the marine environment has allowed recovery from past damage. Divers come from all over the world for what Curaçao offers: shallow reefs, walls that drop hundreds of meters, sunken ships, and a density of marine life that larger, more developed islands have largely lost. There are no rivers in Curaçao, no streams, no lakes of any consequence. The island's fresh water comes almost entirely from desalination plants, which have been operating here since the 1920s and which produce water that is, by global standards, exceptionally clean. The absence of surface water has shaped settlement patterns, agriculture, and economics for centuries. The Dutch colonists tried to grow sugarcane and cotton. Both failed. What survived was aloe cultivation. The Curaçao aloe was once one of the most valuable botanical exports in the world. And, eventually, the realization that the island's wealth would have to come from trade, services, and the things that passed through the harbour rather than from anything that grew on the land. That is the Curaçao you arrive at. An island too dry for conventional agriculture, too small for industrial development, too far south for hurricanes, too well positioned for trade, and too stubbornly itself to be anything other than what it became. Curaçao has approximately 156,000 residents, but the question of who those residents are has never had a simple answer. Walk through Willemstad on any given afternoon and you will hear 4 languages before you reach the end of the main street. Papiamentu, which is the mother tongue of nearly every Curaçaoan, and which you will hear in markets, on doorsteps, between friends, in songs, and increasingly in official contexts. Dutch, the administrative language inherited from the colonial power and still the language of education, government, and official documentation. Spanish, spoken fluently by almost everyone because Venezuela is 65 kilometers away and the cultural gravitational pull of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean is constant. And English, which everyone learns in school and which positions the island for the tourism economy and the global connections that small countries need to survive. The linguistic fluency of Curaçao is not exotic, it is structural. This is a place where identity was always meant to be multilingual, because the people who built this island came from everywhere, and had to talk to each other from the first day. The demographic foundation of Curaçao was laid in the 17th and 18th centuries through the transatlantic slave trade. The Dutch West India Company, which administered the island, made Curaçao one of its most important Caribbean hubs for the trafficking of enslaved Africans. Tens of thousands of captives passed through the island, mostly on their way to other colonies in the Americas, but a significant number stayed, worked on local plantations, and formed the demographic base of what the island would eventually become. When slavery was abolished in 1863, the formerly enslaved population and their descendants were already the majority on the island, and the cultural identity of Curaçao had been fundamentally shaped by African presence, African labor, African music, African food, and African memory. But the African story in Curaçao is not the whole story. Sephardic Jewish merchants arrived in the 17th century, fleeing persecution in Portugal and Spain, and established what is today the oldest continuously operating Jewish congregation in the Americas, Mikveh Israel Emmanuel, whose sand-covered floor and wooden interior have welcomed worshippers since 1651. Dutch settlers, administrators, and traders brought the institutional framework of European governance. Portuguese influence runs through the surnames, the food, and the religious calendar. Chinese workers arrived in the 19th century to work in the oil industry. Lebanese merchants came in the late 1800s and built commercial networks that still exist. Venezuelans, Colombians, Dominicans, and Haitians have arrived in waves over the last century, each contributing a new layer to the demographic complexity. The result is a society that does not fit the standard Caribbean categories. It is not predominantly black in the way that Jamaica or Haiti is. It is not predominantly mixed in the way that the Dominican Republic or Trinidad is. It is genuinely, structurally heterogeneous, with no single ethnic or racial group constituting a majority that overwhelms the others. The visual diversity of a crowd in Willemstad is striking to anyone coming from a more ethnically homogeneous country. Everyone looks like everyone else, and nobody does at the same time. Papiamentu is the linguistic proof of this. The language emerged from contact between African slaves, Dutch colonizers, Portuguese traders, Sephardic Jews, and Spanish-speaking neighbors over a period of centuries. It contains Dutch vocabulary, Portuguese and Spanish grammar, African syntactic patterns, and a melodic cadence that is entirely its own. It is not a broken version of any of those languages. It is a fully formed Creole with its own literature, its own radio stations, its own poets, its own sense of humor, and its own emotional vocabulary that cannot be translated into any of its source languages without losing something essential. The political status of Curaçao is also difficult to categorize. Since October 10, 2010, the island has been a constituent country of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the same arrangement that applies to Aruba and Sint Maarten. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is not a metaphor. It is a legal entity consisting of 4 countries: the Netherlands, Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten. The Dutch king is the head of state of all 4. Foreign policy and defense are handled at the kingdom level. But each constituent country has its own parliament, its own prime minister, its own currency, the Netherlands Antillean guilder, pegged to the US dollar, and extensive autonomy over domestic affairs. This arrangement produces a peculiar situation. A Curaçaoan is a Dutch citizen, A Curaçaoan carries a Dutch passport. A Curaçaoan can study, work, and live anywhere in the European Union without a visa. And yet, Curaçao is not in Europe, is not part of the European Union, and is governed in most practical ways by people who live on the island. The natural environment of Curaçao is, like everything else on the island, easy to underestimate until you actually experience it. The terrestrial landscape is genuinely unusual within the Caribbean context. The dryness that makes the island look brown from the air is not a deficiency. It is the defining characteristic of a biome that is closer, ecologically, to the thorn forests of northeastern Brazil or the dry forests of Central America's Pacific coast than to the lush, rain-soaked tropics that most people associate with the region. The vegetation is sparse, adapted, and unexpectedly diverse. Botanists have identified over 450 plant species on the island, of which a significant number are endemic, found nowhere else in the world. The Cristóbal Park, in the northwestern corner of the island, is the largest protected natural area in Curaçao. It encompasses the Cristóbal at 372 meters, the highest point on the island, and a network of trails that cross through what was once plantation land and is now recovering dry forest. The park is home to the Curaçao white-tailed deer, which was nearly extinct by the mid-20th century and has been brought back through a careful conservation program. It is also home to the barn owl, the troupial, the island's national bird, a striking black and orange songbird, and the blue whiptail lizard, which can be seen darting across the trails with the particular urgency of a reptile that knows it is being watched. The marine environment is where Curaçao truly excels. The fringing reefs that line much of the island's southern coast are among the most accessible reef systems in the world for divers and snorkelers. You can walk from a beach into the water and within 100 meters be over coral formations that host an extraordinary density of marine life. The mushroom forest, a series of coral formations shaped like giant fungi, is one of the most photographed dive sites in the Caribbean. The Superior Producer, a cargo ship that sank in 1977 and now rests in about 30 meters of water, is a destination for divers from around the world. The walls along the western edge of the island drop vertically into deep blue water, creating conditions for pelagic encounters, turtles, reef sharks, eagle rays, and, occasionally, larger species that pass through the deep water beyond the reef edge. The sea turtles of Curaçao deserve specific mention. 4 species nest on the island's beaches: the green turtle, the hawksbill, the loggerhead, and, less commonly, the leatherback. Conservation organizations like the Sea Turtle Conservation Curaçao have been working for decades to protect nesting sites, monitor populations, and educate both residents and visitors about the vulnerability of these animals. The work has paid off. Nesting numbers on several beaches have shown measurable recovery in recent years. And the sight of a female green turtle hauling herself up a beach at night to lay her eggs has become, for those who have witnessed it, one of the most powerful natural experiences the island offers. The climate is consistently warm and consistently windy. Temperatures range from about 25 degrees Celsius at night in the coolest months, January and February, to about 32 degrees during the day in the warmest months and September. The trade wind keeps the perceived temperature lower than the actual temperature, which is why walking around Willemstad on a 30-degree day feels comfortable rather than oppressive. Rainfall averages around 500–600 millimeters per year, concentrated in a short rainy season between October and February, and even during those months, the rain tends to come in short, intense bursts rather than the prolonged drizzle of more temperate climates. The position outside the hurricane belt is the climate feature that most distinguishes Curaçao from its Caribbean neighbors. While islands like Dominica, Puerto Rico, and Barbuda have been devastated by major hurricanes in recent years, Curaçao has not experienced a direct hurricane hit in living memory. The trade winds, the southern latitude, and the surrounding ocean temperatures combine to create conditions that are unfavorable for hurricane formation in the immediate vicinity of the island. It is one of the reasons that the coral reefs are healthy, the infrastructure is intact, and the tourism industry is stable. The reflection on the morning after the match in Kingston. The sun rose over Curaçao at 6:42 am, and the wind was already blowing, as it always blows, from the east. The streets of Willemstad were still littered with the debris of celebration, bottles, flags, paper plates, the evidence of a population that had decided to stay outside all night. The floating bridge opened at 7:15 to let a cargo ship into the harbour and closed again behind it, and the pedestrians who crossed it walked a little slower than usual, taking in the view of the bay in the early light, the colourful houses of Punda reflected in the still water. The small fishing boats tied up along the quay where Venezuelan fishermen normally sell their catch. On a wall near the entrance to the Riff Fort, the colonial-era structure that now houses a cultural centre and a row of restaurants, someone had spray-painted, during the night, 3 words in Papiamentu: "Nos ha llega," we have arrived. Downtown, the flags were out. Not only Curaçaoan flags, flags of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, flags of the European Union, flags of the United States, the island's identity, displayed without contradiction, because that is what Curaçaoan identity is: multiple, layered, and held together not by a single narrative, but by the shared decision to hold together at all. In the harbour, a container ship from Rotterdam was unloading cargo that had left Europe 2 weeks earlier. On its hull, faded by salt and sun, was the name of the shipping line. The captain, when asked by a local journalist what he thought about the football, smiled and said he had heard the news on the ship's radio. He said he had been sailing to Curaçao for 15 years. He said he had never seen the island this happy. On the beach at Mumbo, on the southern coast, the chairs were being set out for the day's tourists. The water was clear. The wind was steady. The sky was the particular blue that only Curaçao's combination of latitude, aridity, and atmospheric conditions can produce. A blue that seems to have been calibrated for postcards, except that no postcard could do it justice. And in a small football stadium on the western edge of the island, a youth team was training, boys of 12 and 13, in jerseys that did not match, running drills on a pitch that was not perfectly flat, under the supervision of a coach who was not famous and would never be famous, doing the work that the entire Curaçao football project depends on. The coach had heard about the World Cup qualification, of course. Everyone had. But what he was thinking about, on this particular morning, was not the World Cup. He was thinking about the boy with the weak left foot who needed extra drills. He was thinking about the goalkeeper who was afraid of high balls. He was thinking about the fact that one of the boys in this group might, in 10 years, be standing in a World Cup stadium, and that the work being done right now, on this imperfect pitch, under this steady wind, was what would determine whether that boy was ready when the moment came. That is the truth about how a small island shocks the football world. It does not happen because of a single qualifying campaign or a single generation of talented players. It happens because of 10,000 mornings like this one. 10,000 boys on 10,000 imperfect pitches in 10,000 small towns and small neighborhoods being taught by 10,000 coaches who are not famous. In a system that does not have the resources of the systems that produce the world's best players, but that has something that those systems, for all their resources, cannot manufacture. The specific, irreplaceable, irrational motivation of playing for a flag that almost nobody else in the world cares about, and caring about it completely. That is what the world saw in November 2025. Not a miracle, not an accident, not a lucky draw or a favorable schedule. What the world saw was the product of a geography, a history, a migration, a language, a diaspora, a federation, a tactical philosophy, and 10,000 mornings on imperfect pitches, all converging at the same moment on the same rectangle of grass in Kingston, Jamaica, where a ball entered a net and a small island became for one night the biggest story in the world. Curaçao arrived. And it is not going anywhere.